may be a little too exciting, a little too engaging, a little too controversial. Tonight might be one of those. Christian nationalism, some of you may be like, whoa. And so I guess before we get started, I'll go ahead and tell you, like, the part of your brain that is like partisan and wants to argue about politics, like, go ahead and turn that part of your brain off. That part of your brain that uses the word them, they, like, try to turn that part of your brain off. This is going to be a little more scholarly, and we're going to try to define our terms really well and think about this concept of Christian nationalism. What does it mean? Is it really an issue? Where does it pop up in our churches? Where does it pop up in the relationship between Christians and non-Christians? Okay? And hopefully these slides will behave themselves because there's a bunch of animations and whatnot. Okay. So first, let's start with the word nationalism. I deleted like 10 or 15 introductory slides to jump straight into just defining our terms. So if you hear someone use the word nationalism, they mean lots of different things. Those could mean, sometimes nationalism means something like whatever globalism is means not that. So if you think of people who are like, oh, the United Nations, like, no, that's not in the cards. Or people who say, like, we should not get involved in foreign wars. Some people would say, like, we should not, we should be really clamped down on immigration. All of these kind of terms sometimes correspond to the term nationalism, and we're not really going to talk about those tonight. That's not what we have in mind. Economic protectionism would be like, tariffs, things like that, that would say, if you make it in this country, you get an economic advantage. So all these things get the term nationalism sometimes. Oh, there we go. There's the rest of the thing. So people who are like, I don't like the United Nations. Anyone know this man? Anyone know this name? Oh, this is Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan would be a good early example of someone who's like, the United States should stay out of other people's business, and we should make it easier on American goods manufacturers, things like that. When you think of tight immigration controls, when you hear phrases like this, like Britain for the British, right? These are all terms you might hear associated with nationalism. I have a brother who lives in the UK, and he does get himself into trouble sometimes because some of these more British nationalists will say, like, we've got to stop these foreigners from coming in, don't you think? And then he responds in his American accent, like, I'm actually a foreigner here on a guest visa. Do we have a problem? And so anyway, we're not going to get into any of that. That's not what I mean by nationalism. Tonight we're going to talk about a different kind of nationalism, and I don't want to confuse it with the concept of patriotism. I don't know if y'all recognize this. This is Kyle Field in the weeks following 9/11. As you can see, everyone color coordinated in red, white, and blue. So patriotism is not the same thing as nationalism. Patriotism means love of country. And when we say love of country, we're generally thinking about the history and ideals of the country, not like specific races or ethnicities or religion, but love of the country the same way you love your family. So you love your family, you love your country. Maybe one good example, I was trying to think of like what encompasses patriotism for me, and this may be the best example. This is former President George W. Bush, and on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, he spoke in Pennsylvania on the site of the Flight 93 crash. And one interesting thing he said about Flight 93 is that it was kind of random, like if this happened to you. And he said, the 33 passengers and 7 crew of Flight 93 could have been any group of citizens selected by fate. In a sense, they stood in for us all, but the terrorists soon discovered that a random group of Americans is an exceptional group of people. Maybe more than any other, when I think of like what brings out my patriotic heart, I think this quote really does it. That feeling of love for your country, love for your fellow Americans, the same way that you kind of love your family, okay? So that's patriotism. This was from a few years ago. Nationalism is different than patriotism. Nationalism is not just about loving your country, it's about how you define your country. What kind of a culture does your country have? Does the nation, the people, and the state overlap? This is not unique to America. It applies to lots of different countries. So some examples. Let's try to give you an example of nationalism, and then we'll later convert this into Christian nationalism, and you'll see how these relate. So nationalism says the country is defined by a particular cultural identity. And then on top of that, the government should act to make it so or keep it so. And it's the second part that really makes nationalism nationalism. It's the idea that France is a certain way. It has a certain cultural character, and the government must act to keep it that way. Or America has a certain cultural character, and the government should act to keep it that way. And for most of you, this part is maybe not the controversial part. It's the second part. Once you say the government should act to make it so, you should say, like, what do you mean? What exactly is the government going to do? Is there some kind of law that they're going to pass? Is there something they're going to force us to do? So this is the part. The second part is the part that should make you maybe more nervous. And let me give you some examples of this. Nationalism, the reason people like this idea of nationalism is it's a way to push back on cultural shifts. So here in the United States, one thing you'll hear people complain about is that the country's changing, the culture's changing, and they'll typically blame a few common culprits. They'll say, oh, Hollywood, puts out all this stuff and they're trying to change the culture, and Hollywood is out of touch with normal Americans, blah, 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 things like that. The New York Times, the New York Times. So you people here complain about Hollywood, like entertainment media, news media, and then this last place, this is Harvard, right? So they would complain about places like Harvard or places like Texas A&M and say that academia is shifting the culture or trying to change the cultural character of the country. And nationalism says, like, I don't like that. I don't like those shifts. So here are a couple of examples. These are both what I would consider not like random screamers on the internet, but actual scholars who've really thought things through. Rich Lowry is the editor-in-chief of National Review. That's a major accomplishment and a major person. He says, the overarching priority of American nationalists has to be protecting and fostering the cultural nation as a source of coherence and belonging and the foundation of our way of life. So look at these words. Cultural nation is a source of coherence, belonging, the idea that this is America and we all share certain things culturally in common so that we have those things in common, and that's what unites us. Similarly, Yoram Hazony, he wrote this book, The Virtue of Nationalism. He says, the U.S. is held together by the bonds of mutual loyalty that unite the American nation, an English-speaking nation whose constitution and religious traditions were originally rooted in the Bible, Protestantism, republicanism, and the common law of England. So he's saying, like, what defines America? This cultural background defines America, and we should try to keep it so. So this is what people mean by nationalism. Sometimes the government does this, and it's pretty innocuous. So have you ever seen, like, at a sporting event, like at an NFL game, they'll honor America's troops? Have you ever seen them do that? And everybody says, oh, that's nice. So the government pays for that, and the reason they do it is specifically to try to create that unified sense. I mean, even the away fans, everyone applauds for the troops. It's something that we hold in common. Years ago, Ken Burns had a documentary series about America's national parks, and it was called America's Best Idea. And the idea of the national parks is something that will still be here hundreds of years from now, and that we preserve and cherish for our children, our grandchildren, and their grandchildren, et cetera. This is something we all kind of agree America is lucky to have places like Yellowstone. Or if you go to the national monuments in Washington, D.C., these are all ways of saying this says something about our cultural character and binds us all together as Americans. So sometimes these nationalistic type symbols can be kind of good and pretty innocuous. Doesn't really hurt anybody, and everybody kind of likes it. And you could even have policies that try to make life easier on young families, the way that we structure our tax credits, the way that we structure our schools, and say, we have a pro-family culture, and I want to make it easy on young families. So these are all kind of good, pretty low-harm examples. So that's the idea. Nationalism seeks to create a sense of shared culture, shared community, and shared tribe, that we're all together. And honestly, I've got a picture of my family here. You can tell this picture's out of date because my son is now as tall as I am. I will tell you, the real reason that you would say, I would like my culture to be unified and have a shared cultural commitment and identity that I understand, is it makes it way easier to raise your family. If all of your neighbors are like you and share those same commitments and you kind of are on the same page with each other, it makes the trust levels high. It means that your trust level with your school, with your neighbors, with your school board, with other people in your state, it makes it high and makes it a lot easier to get through the day. Christians, you can imagine, especially feel that appeal. If your culture is broadly Christian, it makes life a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier to raise children. Does that make sense? So that's the real reason that nationalism is appealing. Okay? The trouble with nationalism is, what if someone doesn't fit that culture? If they don't fit that culture, then nationalism says, hey man, we have a defining culture, and you have to be part of that defining culture in order to be a full member of the nation. Otherwise, you're a second-class citizen. And this is the real problem with nationalism, is that it is inherently illiberal once it actually has the force of law. So I'll give you some examples of just what I would say are nationalistic type of laws. We'll get into this more as we go, but we're going to, in a moment, shift to Christian nationalism. So if you say only Christians can hold public office, that would be an example of a Christian nationalist law, and that would tell people who are not Christians, you are a second-class citizen. You cannot hold public office. So that would be an example. And it would be illiberal in that sense because it doesn't treat all of its citizens the same. It doesn't give them all the same rights. Some of you, when you see this word liberal, you may think liberal means like left-wing, right? That's actually not what that means. The word liberal here means classically liberal, and that's what you would associate with our founding documents, with the Bill of Rights, with the Declaration of Independence. Classical liberalism is this idea that the government is limited in what it can do. So it may be a democracy, like people vote, they vote in their leaders, but the government is still limited, and even the majority has no ability to squish the rights of the minority. That's what defines classical liberalism. Limited government, guaranteed rights, that sort of thing. And nationalism is inherently illiberal because it says some people have more rights than others. So that's the trouble with nationalism. Here's a good example. Viktor Orban, some of y'all may know, he's been the leader of Hungary for some time. And he's a good example. Hungary is a good example of a nationalist country. Orban said, I'm convinced that Hungary has the right, and every nation has the right, to say that it does not want its country to change. So he's saying Hungary has a particular culture, and we don't want it to change. And we will use government, the force of government, we will use the force of law to keep it from changing. It's a little bit weird because it's kind of saying we like our culture how it is, let's press pause and not allow it to change. I will go ahead and tell you, I think this is misguided, partially because there are all these examples from history, some funny examples from 100 years ago. It's 2025 right now, so 100 years ago, the new hot thing was jazz. And there were a number of nationalists who said, like, jazz is un-American. No more jazz. And if it was up to them, they would have used the force of law to make jazz not a thing. And now, 100 years later, there's hardly anything more American than jazz. And so this idea of saying, pause, let's not change the culture anymore, no jazz, thank you, is really misguided, okay? It's also kind of hard to think, like, how do you keep the culture from changing? Here's one kind of fun example. This is France. Rhys Lowry said, France undertook an intensive, far-reaching campaign to wipe out distinctive cultures and dialects to forge the common national culture. A lot of this had to do with language. Hazoni says the French have a long history of expressing their national freedom through the suppression, national freedom through suppression, weird, of languages and religious practices they find offensive. John Mersheimer, another nationalist advocate, he says the key to success is to eliminate heterogeneity. And in his case, he meant by enforcing a single national language. So if this sounds kind of draconian, like the government forcing a certain culture, then you have understood correctly. It's the idea that the government uses the force of law to try to wipe out heterogeneity and make everything the same. This has been the case in France for a long time now. Even some of you may have seen the musical My Fair Lady. There's a line in the musical My Fair Lady where the English professor, Henry Higgins, actually says, he says, the French don't care what you do so long as you pronounce it properly. And so that's exactly what's going on here. The French don't care what you do as long as you pronounce it properly and use French and don't use something else. So this would be an example of nationalist policy because it's saying France is for the French. Now speak French, please, and pronounce it properly. Okay. One extreme example of nationalism in a very high up place is at Harvard Law School, Professor Adrian Vermeule. I want you to look closely at what he's saying. He says, such an approach, one might call it common good constitutionalism, should be based on the principles that government helps direct persons, associations, and society generally toward the common good. What is good? What do we see as good? Government direct us toward the common good. And he says, the libertarian assumption central to free speech law and free speech ideology, the government is forbidden to judge the quality or moral worth of public speech. We have to get rid of that. That's what he says. So you may say, like, I think this guy's like kind of like against the Constitution, like he doesn't really love the Bill of Rights. And he would say, like, yeah, maybe the government has to, maybe the Bill of Rights is preventing the government from pursuing the common good. Now, if you feel nervous at hearing something like that, I think you probably should. You probably should feel nervous at hearing something like that. Because you have to think, like, if government has the purpose and the force and the power to say, we are going to pursue and legislate which we think is the common good, we're going to make it happen, then you should automatically think, like, what happens if the people who disagree with me are in power? If the people who disagree with you are in power, your political opponents are in power, that means all of a sudden the government's saying, for the common good, I'm afraid you cannot say that. You cannot do that. You cannot practice that. And then you say, like, oh, maybe I've done something really horrible. This is the origin, of course, of this, maybe one of the more famous tweets there's ever been. I never thought leopards would eat my face, sobs woman who voted for the leopards eating people's faces party, right? So if you say, I would like to give government the power to dictate the common good, oh no, the government has the power to dictate the common good, oh no. So, by the way, you see this idea that classical liberalism, limited government, guaranteed rights, is in some sense derived from the golden rule. What if I were the minority? What if the government disagreed with me? I would like to have my rights guaranteed and not have a government with the power to squish me and squish my rights, okay? So that's nationalism broadly. So let's kind of jump over to Christian nationalism. So I think we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. I think we all agree cultural Christianity has been on the decline, even at A&M. Cultural Christianity has been on the decline, certainly since the late 1980s, in terms of like what percentage of American culture, what percentage of Americans would even define themselves as Christian. So I think this is really interesting. These two gentlemen, this is Thomas Kidd, this is Andrew Walker. They're both professors at Southern Baptist seminaries, and they react to this cultural shift differently. Thomas Kidd says, okay, fine, if nominal, utilitarian, civil religious Christianity, quote unquote, is mostly what's fading away with the cratering of American church membership, then I say good riddance. Thomas Kidd is saying cultural Christians don't really know Jesus. It's not real Christianity. So if it goes away, good riddance. We didn't need it anyway. That was fake Christianity. But Walker says, without a Christian culture, American civil society will be hollowed out. The nation will be a sadder, more awful place. This kind of goes with what I was saying earlier, which is like, as the culture becomes less Christianish, it's a whole lot harder to raise a family. Do y'all resonate with one or the other of these? Who resonates with what Kidd says? Who resonates with what Walker says? I'll be really honest. I kind of resonate with both of them. I see where they're both coming from. But you see, one of them is celebrating the demise of cultural Christianity, and the other one is bemoaning it. Because these shifts are hard, but a nation that is nominally, a bunch of people who are nominally Christian, isn't necessarily spiritually a great thing. So you can see there's ups and downs to these shifts, okay? So based on our definition of nationalism before, nationalism was about the nation should have a culture, so we can now say Christian nationalism means that the country should be defined by a Christian cultural identity and the government should act to make it so. Again, to give you examples of what I would consider Christian nationalism or Christian nationalist policies would be something like only Christians can own property, only Christians can run for office, only Christians can immigrate, right? Things like that. Caleb, did you have a question? Yeah, go, hit me. Yep.
If someone wants the government to do things according to, if a Christian wants the government to do things that their conscience dictates, but they don't, so they want the government to enforce Christian ideas because they're voting according to their conscience, but they don't necessarily think that the government should coerce people valuing those things as because.
Yeah, I know exactly where you're going. I've got a slide specifically on that later. I'm exactly with you. So this Christian national, and I'll go ahead and tell you, I think I kind of know what you have in mind, and I would not say that that's Christian nationalism. I would say it's not. The ultimate example being William Wilberforce saying, based on his Christian ideals and his Christian conscience and his familiarity with the Bible, he would say, I think the British Empire should outlaw slavery. And he persuaded people around him to do it. And eventually the British Empire did outlaw slavery, and they did it without a civil war. Amazing. We would say he persuaded others, but he said, this is a broad good. I'm not necessarily trying to set Christianity up as the culture and getting the government to enforce that. He would say this is good for everybody, kind of regardless of what the culture is, or regardless of what religion you are. So, good. We'll get into that a little bit more so. Here's some statistics that kind of get you, see where we're at. Percentage of respondents who believe the Constitution would or would not allow the government to declare the U.S. a Christian nation by party. These numbers are kind of high, right? 43%, that's kind of high. Percentage of respondents in favor or opposed to declaring the U.S. a Christian nation by party. Again, some numbers that are kind of high. And then here's the one that definitely worried me. 32% of Americans said one should be Christian to really be American. I don't know, these don't quite fit policy. These are more Christian nationalist attitudes, right? There's not a specific policy of like, we should have passed this law that does this thing. But this is more of an attitude that would indicate Christian nationalism, saying that America would be defined as a Christian nation. Okay, so I'm now going to walk you through what I think are some real problems with Christian nationalism, and I'm open to debate and discussion on almost all of these. But I'm going to walk you through why I think this is probably not a great idea. We will talk a little bit about the Constitution, and we will talk quite a bit about the nature of Christianity and the nature and what Scripture has to say about government. First off, I think it's pretty easy to say that Christian nationalism is unconstitutional. So the Bill of Rights says Congress, this is Bill of Rights, this is number one, Amendment number one, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So you'll hear lawyers talk about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So these are both there. One way you can think about these is if there were an established religion, that would mean like one religion is is in charge, and the others, maybe we'll let you exist, but like we all know that this is number one. The other extreme would be to say, hey, I'm so concerned. I really don't want to establish a religion. So I'm going to say like no religion at all. Keep your religion out of the public square. And if you say something, if you say as a Christian I think blank, you're out. So this is where some Americans are so concerned about establishment that they actually get over here into what we would call the naked public square that starts to prohibit free exercise thereof. Katie, I think we were talking about this earlier, this idea that if you are motivated by any kind of religious reasoning, they would be like, keep it to yourself, it doesn't belong in the public square. The Constitution says you can't establish and you can't prohibit free exercise. So what we're going to, I think a more constitutional way of approaching this would be the open public square where people are free from government interference to practice their religion. Most of the time when there's a controversy about the First Amendment, it's when people are kind of squeezed from both of these. I'll give you an example. There was a recent Supreme Court case about a high school football coach who went out and prayed at the 50-yard line. And people were like, can he do that? He's a state employee. Are we establishing a religion by having him do that? And then people said like, yeah, but he has rights too. If you tell him he can't do that, are you prohibiting his free exercise? So you see, some people are worried about the establishment part, other people are worried about the free exercise part, and the Supreme Court took that up, and they basically said as long as he's not coercive and he's acting in his capability as a private citizen and not as a representative of the state, then he can go out and do whatever he wants. But if he's saying, you football team must do this, then he would be acting much more in his capacity as an employee of the state. So that's an example of how you get through these First Amendment questions, right? So that one's much easier. This is partially motivated by America's history relative to England. So look at this. Back in from the 1660s to the 1680s, there were what was called the Test Acts. Religious tests were needed, William Blackstone explained, to protect the established church and the government against perils from nonconformists of all denominations, infidels, Turks, Jews, heretics, papists, and sectaries. So basically saying, if you want to hold office in England, you better not be on that list. Much better to be Church of England, right? Something like that. And the U.S. Constitution, in response to this, there's actually somewhere else in the Constitution beyond the First Amendment where it addresses this. In Article 6, the Constitution says, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. So any kind of law that says you must be Christian to hold office is going to be held as unconstitutional right out of the gates because the text of the Constitution on this point is so clear. There was actually a big controversy about this back in 2017. There was a nominee for like the Office of Budget Management or something under the first Trump administration in 2017, and the person who was the nominee was a Christian, and Senator Bernie Sanders really gave him a hard time and indicated that he would vote against this guy because this guy had written an article talking about his view of Scripture. And the part that Senator Sanders objected to was the belief in hell, the belief that non-Christians would go to hell. And Sanders basically said, if you believe that, then I don't see how you can serve the American people. And a number of people were like, Senator Sanders, are you suggesting a religious test? That if you believe in hell, you can't hold public office, because that would probably violate the Constitution. So there you go. That would be an example of where this kind of thinking comes in. Number two, this is a surprising part. I just told you Christian nationalism is unconstitutional, but it actually has been tried before in the United States. This will be a little surprising. Some of you may have heard of Blaine amendments. President Grant in 1875 says, not $1 shall be appropriated to support sectarian schools. Now that sounds like, a Blaine amendment is saying no federal money for any religious school. And actually in our day and time, Blaine amendments have been used for that purpose. But in 1875, what that meant was no money for Catholic schools. The culture was broadly Protestant, and so if you started a private school, it was probably Catholic. And this was effectively the Protestant dominant culture saying, make sure no federal money goes to these Catholic schools. So this was there to try to assert, we are a Protestant country, not a Catholic country. Since then, Blaine amendments across the board have found to be wanting where the Constitution is concerned, so they're kind of on their way out for that reason. You could tell this was the case because people at the time were super worried about Catholics. This is a famous political cartoon from the era. Look real closely at this funny little political cartoon. These are, yeah, Popigators here, right? So this is their little Pope hat, And so this shows that, like, you can imagine the late 1800s, there were a lot of immigrants from places like Italy and Ireland, and a lot of Americans were like, oh my, Catholics. Oh. And this anti-Catholic attitude has really persisted, in many decades after that, to the point that many Americans were super worried about John F. Kennedy being elected president in 1960. Because they're like, oh my word, he's a Catholic. Does that mean he has to listen to everything the Pope says? So these anti-Catholic attitudes persisted and occasionally found their way into public policy in the 1800s. All my Catholic friends love this. They wish they could have these little alligator hats. So there you go. All right. As you might imagine, Christian nationalism has been tried before in Europe. I mentioned what had happened in Britain before, but really the history of Europe from the Protestant Reformation forward, if I can get this to go, oh, there it goes, is a history of religious intolerance. If you're a Catholic in a Protestant country, or if you're a Protestant in a Catholic country, there's this constant attitude of like, you do not fit the culture of our nation, and you will pay with the force of government behind it, right? So this is where you would see Protestants hanging Catholics, Catholics hanging Protestants, and that sort of thing. You can imagine the framers of the U.S. Constitution are exactly trying to avoid this sort of outcome, okay? And this somewhat persists even up to this day, that if you define the nation as belonging to a certain religious view, then you're kind of reducing the nation to you're reducing religion to mere tribalism. The idea that, like, if you grow up in Ireland, you're Catholic. And people would say, like, all right, I was born in Ireland, I guess I'm Catholic, regardless of their actual theological views. There's a famous joke that I think gets this point across nicely. It is the 1970s, and a man from London travels to Belfast, and he is out too late. He's looking for his hotel. He doesn't know where to go, and sure enough, he's walking along the streets, and then a group of young toughs sees him, and they call out to him, "You, are you Protestant or Catholic?" And he was like, "Oh, no, neither. Just leave me. Are you Protestant or Catholic?" "I'm atheist, actually." "Are you a Protestant atheist or a Catholic atheist?" The joke is funny because it's actually true. The idea of, like, theological beliefs, belief in God has nothing to do with it. Protestant or Catholic has only to do with your tribal affiliation with Ireland or with the United Kingdom. I had the opportunity to see this problem up close and personal in Glasgow recently. I mentioned my brother lives in the UK. He lives in Glasgow, and the top two soccer teams in Glasgow are Rangers FC and Celtic FC. And as you might imagine, the green one is the Celtic. And so if you live in Glasgow, Glasgow's right across from Belfast, and so there's the same Catholic-Protestant tension. And basically, if you're Catholic/Irish, you support Celtic. And if you are British/Protestant and you support the monarchy, you cheer for Rangers. It was even the case that Rangers actually didn't sign any Catholic players for many decades. I had the opportunity to attend a Rangers home match in Glasgow this past August. For sale, I bought this, here it is. For sale at the soccer match was this. Think about this. For sale at a soccer match, like it's a big thing in Europe to, like, you have your scarf and then ahead of the match you hold it up, that sort of thing. It is weird. Do y'all agree this is weird? Yeah. This has nothing to do with theology. If you own this scarf, if you're like, yeah, 100% Protestant, this is a theologically contentless statement. It says far more about where you're from and how you feel about the British monarchy and a bunch of junk that went down between the Irish and the British in the 1700s than it does about your theology. That's silly. That's what I mean by reducing your religious views to mere tribalism. There are a lot of people out there waving these scarves who don't know the first thing about what it means to be Protestant and may not believe in God at all. But that's what nationalism, religious nationalism, does. It reduces your religion to mere tribalism, mere culture. One of the interesting things about that is Christians are, if you think about the Christian missionary movement, the Christian missionary movement is inherently at war with religious nationalism. So imagine, my friend Samuel here is from India. In India, there are some Hindu nationalists, and you can imagine someone saying, well, India is a Hindu country. So you have your country, we have our country. You lay off, you Christians have your country, so you stay over there, we have our country, we stay over here. A Christian missionary says, I'm not going to abide by that agreement. I'm not. Christianity has no boundaries. There is no country you're going to keep us out of. We're coming, whether the government likes it, whether you like it or not, right? Paul repeatedly says, wherever he goes, they say, like, please leave, right? And he says, hey, man, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And Jesus actually promises his disciples, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you'll be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. So the idea of saying, India is a Hindu country? Oh, well, I guess we're not going to send missionaries there. That doesn't make any sense to Christians. Christians say, I don't care what your religious nationalist attitude says, we are coming because we want to tell you about Jesus. This one may hit a little close to home. Christian nationalism attributes religious significance to the nation. Some of you may have seen images like these. What do you see here? Flag, national symbol and religious symbol mixed together, as if the nation, the country of the United States, has some religious significance. In fact, you'll often see times people even applying Old Testament verses that were intended for Israel and applying those to the United States, almost acting as if the United States has some sort of covenant relationship with God or has some eternal spiritual significance. You can imagine this causes people to act in weird ways where they say, like, oh man, if this next election doesn't go the way we want, that's a spiritual disaster. And it's like, what are you talking about? There is no agreement, there is no spiritual significance to a country like France or the United Kingdom or the United States, right? These are mere countries. They're not equal to the nation. They're not equal to our faith. In fact, the early Christians kind of took this attitude of like, we don't really have a homeland. And Peter says, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh. Similarly, Paul says our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. So he says, don't think of yourself primarily as a citizen of your country. Think of yourself as a citizen of heaven. You're just a passing through. You are a sojourner and an exile. Okay? This is one of the really helpful ways to think about this is if there was ever a time when people would say the nation and the religion are the same, it would be in the Roman Empire. Constantine declares the Roman Empire officially Christian, and then about 100 years later, the Roman Empire starts to fall apart, and people freaked out. They're like, what are we going to do? This is the end of the world. And the great theologian Augustine wrote this wonderful book called The City of God, and the idea is the city of God and the city of man are not the same thing. And even if Rome falls, if the city of man falls, that's not the same as the city of God falling. I've paraphrased, this is not Augustine's exact words, I've paraphrased the city of God here. Augustine could say, he says, the Roman Empire could disappear in a puff of smoke tomorrow, and the Church of Jesus Christ will soldier on. And if you ever think, I'm spending too much time worrying and thinking about politics, just repeat to yourself, the United States could disappear in a puff of smoke tomorrow, and the Church of Jesus Christ will soldier on. That's a fact. I mean, this hits really close to home for me because Russell Moore actually told a story about how people would say to him, you know, America's the last hope for Christianity. And he was like, you mean Christianity is the last hope for America? No. America is the last hope for Christianity. That's crazy. America could disappear in a puff of smoke tomorrow, and the Church of Jesus would soldier on, right? Our spiritual fate, Jesus' plans are not tied to American elections and things like that, right? The whole country could be gone tomorrow, and it wouldn't make it, and God's plans would still come through. Jesus mentions this sort of thing. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. This is when he's before Pilate. He says, if my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. So if you find yourself fighting, you may think like, maybe I'm not doing what Jesus wanted. My servants would be fighting that I might be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world. And so the history of what's called Christendom, the idea of a series of kingdoms that are themselves Christian, is kind of made up of a series of just us ignoring this sort of thing. So you can imagine, my kingdom, your kingdom, is not of this world, My kingdom's not of this world. Your kingdom's of this world, right? This is us. This is Christians constantly saying like, oh, your kingdom is of this world. And Jesus is saying, no, my kingdom's not of this world. And so we have to kind of repeat this to ourselves to avoid falling into those kind of attitudes, okay? This one also hits home pretty hard, is that Christian nationalism is coercive. If you say the nation is Christian, you must be Christian in order to vote, in order to hold property, you are then coercing people, financially maybe, to become Christian or to nominally become Christian, right? So this is a concern because this is not how Christianity spreads. Jesus says, go and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all I've commanded you. In 1 Peter, Peter says, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. So I hope what you see is these are words like teaching, gentleness, respect. This is persuasion. How do you convince someone to become a Christian? Through persuasion, not through coercion, not through force. Look at what Paul does in Acts 17. He reasoned with them from the Scriptures. He explains and proves. This sounds like a Ratio Christi meeting, right? This is what we do. We reason with each other, we explain, and we try to prove things. And so in that sense, Ratio Christi is in a wonderful tradition dating back to the Apostle Paul. Now contrast that with Charlemagne, right? Charlemagne goes to the Saxons, he conquers the Saxons and says, well, you can get baptized or you can be stabbed. What's it going to be? So then you'd say, like, okay, those people who said, I will choose baptism, I will choose not stabbing, whatever the not stabbing option is, I'll choose that. Are those really Christians? Do they really have a relationship with Jesus? Have they really experienced spiritual transformation? I don't think so, right? So that's not really how someone becomes a Christian. And if you make a bunch of Christians by threatening them with the sword, it seems spiritually counterproductive. All right? So I'll go ahead and tell you this crazy story. This man, Herschel Levi, and this is in the early 1800s, he was Jewish, he was a lawyer, and he sought public office, and they said, like, hey man, you can't hold public office unless you're a Christian. And they tried to make an exception for him, they couldn't, and he said, fine, I'll become a Christian. So he was baptized, and his family was baptized, and then he was able to hold public office. And if from a Christian nationalist perspective, you'd be like, oh, great, Christians in public office. Maybe that family is now Christian. Actually, something very different happened. Herschel actually changed his name to Heinrich Marx, and one of those young kids who was baptized was named Karl. This is Karl Marx. And you can imagine young Karl growing up with this in his background thinking, is this what religion is? Right? A way to make a business deal? A way to get ahead politically? I think with this background, it's not hard to understand how Karl Marx began to say things like that religion is the opiate of the masses, and that religion is merely a way that the powerful exert power over others. Here's Karl. So ultimately, I think several of y'all were talking about this before we got started, when you mix church and state, there's a lot of problems that begin to happen. You can violate people's religious liberty by coercing them and forcing them to be a certain religion. Otherwise, they can't buy or sell or own land or hold office. You end up incentivizing false conversions. We reduce Christianity to a tribal marker. I mean, this happens in Texas, right? People will say things like, well, I'm from Texas, I guess I'm a Christian. And you're like, no, it doesn't work that way. But this kind of thing can happen, right? You can end up with idolatry toward the nation and political goals that are not eternal. And ultimately, if you mix church and state, I think we've seen this kind of thing, if you mix church and state, then you may begin to have the state in charge of theological points. You can imagine the idea of like, do you really want the state in charge of deciding what is heresy and what is orthodoxy? I don't. Because they will use it for whatever their own political ends are. Right? When you invite the church, when you mix the church and the state wins. And you'll end up reducing the church to a plaything of the state, to a tool of the state. So that's a worry. Sadly, like, you know, we're all associated with like this phrase, "In God we trust." This phrase became widespread in the era where we were trying to combat communism. Right? It was meant as an anti-communist slogan. And I'm like, no, that's not quite as good as what I had hoped. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, right? Oh, sorry. Let me go back. Oh, we skipped over it. There we go. I think this is interesting. Jesus tells Peter in Matthew 16, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I'm a big religious art fan. I'm especially a fan of this artist, El Greco. And whenever you see any painting, really, of Peter, you'll often see the keys. Do you see the keys dangling from his arm? Here's a little zoomed in. If you've ever been to the Vatican, you'll see the symbol of the Pope, or the two keys together, with this in mind. Then Peter has an interesting side adventure later on in the Garden of Gethsemane. Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? One common thing you'll hear about the idea of like where do church and state have their separate realms is the idea that Jesus gave Peter the keys and not the sword. Jesus gave Peter the keys, not the sword. And Jesus gives Caesar the sword, not Peter the sword, right? Peter doesn't have the sword to convert at the point of the sword, and he doesn't give Caesar the keys, meaning he doesn't give the government theological authority. That's the church's realm. And if you mix the two, you're in for some real trouble, right? This shows up in Romans 13. Romans 13 is the classic passage that talks about like what the purpose of government are. Paul talks about how rulers are meant to restrain evil. They're not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. They're meant to promote justice and preserve order. That authority is God's servant for your good, and those who resist will incur judgment. It's amazing that Paul said this even when the government of his time was pretty evil and not very just. He says the ideal of what government is instituted by God to restrain evil, promote justice, and preserve order, and sadly, yes, to tax us. Because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God. But promoting true religion at the point of a sword with government force is not on the agenda. That's not there in Romans 13. Salvation doesn't come through human coercion. Now, to your question, Caleb, should Christians be active politically? Of course. Of course Christians can be active politically. And should Christians turn the Christian part of their brain off when they're active politically? Again, no. Christians should advocate for biblical principles, for Christian principles, justice, freedom, human flourishing. This is a picture from pro-life Aggies. I think that's a great example. Christian nationalism is not after just principles. It's after power, that Christianity is marked out as the national culture and identity with state power behind it. So Christians, really from time immemorial, have been the ones advocating for human rights, for the rights of those who are the weakest, right? It was the Christians who would go into dumps in the 2nd and 3rd century, find babies who had been abandoned there by their parents, and adopt those babies and started the first orphanages, right? That's an example of Christians saying, based on our Christian principles, that baby is made in the image of God, and we are going to take care of this baby. And they may even advocate for laws that say that exposing or killing an infant is wrong, right? So these early laws against infanticide are motivated by Christian principles. Katie, this is kind of prompted by your question. This means things like advocating for pro-life laws, saying I want an end to predatory lending and how that goes after the weak, banning prostitution, maybe even zoning laws excluding pornography sales. Some of y'all may not realize this. Times Square used to be a complete, utter wasteland. And now it's like very tourist-friendly and nice because of zoning laws that exclude the sale of pornography in certain places. You can have pro-family tax laws, tax-exempt status for religious institutions. Governments can't interfere in who a church hires or not. Do you see, all these are based on Christian principles, could be, but they don't necessarily elevate Christianity and say, this is the law of the land. This is good for everybody. Everyone flourishes in this kind of case. Whereas if Christian nationalist laws would be something more like this. Only members of a certain religion can hold public office. Only some religions can get building permits. And public speech against the dominant religion, including missionary talk, is unacceptable. I spent a lot of time recently in Saudi Arabia, and those are all laws in Saudi Arabia. So that's an example of religious nationalism. So I think this is not religious nationalism, and this clearly is. That's the distinction I guess I would make. Katie?
I guess one of my confusions or difficulties is it seems like a lot of people are defining Christian nationalism not the way you're defining it, but they're defining it as like basically the government should advocate Christian values and pass laws. If you're a Christian who believes the government should advocate Christian values and pass laws, then you're a Christian nationalist. So it's this label that's getting attached to anyone who has anything green.
I agree.
In reality, many people, like at least many people I know who even maybe would call themselves Christian nationalists would be against all the red things, and they'd be for all the green things. And so there's a mismatch of the term, how it's being colloquially used versus the more technical scholarly definition.
Right, I agree, but even the scholarly definition I tried to give tonight, a lot of this talk is based on the book, The Religion of American Greatness by Paul Miller, who's a professor at Georgetown. But I feel like everybody who's here, or everybody who watches this online, saying Christian nationalism is the culture of the nation should be Christian and the government should act to make it so, like, I think that's short enough and clear enough that like we should try to say that's what Christian nationalism actually is. So if you find yourself in those conversations, I would just try to give a better definition, because the other definition is pretty wishy-washy, whereas I think the one I've tried to give is a little more clear-cut, and you can start to divide the green from the red a little more easily. So yeah, almost done. I haven't said this yet, but I want to go ahead and say this. I'm going to be brutally honest. Christian nationalism is not really going to happen, right? If you said like, no Muslims can immigrate to the United States, the Supreme Court will strike it down. The Constitution is too clear cut. So even though a lot of people may say like, I like Christian nationalism, like it's not going to happen. It's not actually going to happen. There's too many constitutional barriers. This book by Stephen Wolfe, The Case for Christian Nationalism, even Wolfe kind of says like, yeah, this is kind of a pipe dream. This is what I would like to happen, but I know it's not really going to happen. So nationalism, I don't think is actually going to happen, but advocacy for Christian nationalism is all over the place. And my frustration is that advocacy for Christian nationalist laws, which are not going to happen, end up alienating non-Christians for no reason at all. So I'm not worried about Christian nationalism actually becoming policy. I'm worried that Christian nationalism is going to drive a wedge between Christians and non-Christians for no good reason. That's my real concern. It antagonizes non-Christians for no reason at all. So I'll go ahead and end there. Some discussion points I think we can talk about. Can any kind of nationalism, including religious nationalism, can it exist without becoming a liberal? This question I just raised, are these policies actually going to happen? So if you say you're a Christian nationalism, is that more about policy or about like where you're affiliated and what your attitudes are? And if we don't want to be nationalists, but you do want to steer the culture in a different direction, what can you do? What are some actual tools that we have at our disposal to try to steer the culture differently? Okay, with that, I will go ahead and stop. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. Okay. We had a few questions along the way. More questions? Sir. Oh, there's a mic. Great.
Thank you for this talk. Is very good. Intuitively, I'm sympathetic towards your argument. But one thing that keeps coming to my mind in this is that if Christianity is true, then the eternal salvation is the ultimate good. And since any kind of public order, whatever kind of constitution there is always going to be directed towards certain kinds of public goods, wouldn't a public order that doesn't direct towards the ultimate good not actually be a very good public order? In other words, wouldn't government that is not directing towards the best good there is be deficient in some way? And would that not count as an argument for Christian nationalism?
Yeah, so, I mean, Charlemagne might have thought the same thing. Like, hey, what's the best? People becoming Christians. All right, let's do it. And I think the argument back is becoming a Christian, someone being saved, is not the sort of thing that can happen via government force. So the best the government can do is establish a free zone where Christians are free to evangelize and share their faith as much as they want without any kind of government squishing their rights along the way. I don't, like, honestly, this idea of someone with the power of government, with the power of government violence behind them, deciding what's the best good? What if someone said, what if someone was a Mormon and they said, what's the greatest good? It's people becoming Mormon. All right, we're going to use government power to make sure that people become Mormon and not anything else. All of a sudden, you're like, whoa, I don't want the government making that decision. So the best we have in the meantime would be a free and open democracy with a classically liberal democracy where rights are protected, and Christianity can contend for itself in the marketplace of public ideas, where you actually persuade people into the faith, which is how they actually become Christian. I do think you have one particular point, which is some people you may sometimes think like democracy is not the best. Like democracy is a mess. I don't like democracy. You know what would be amazing? A benevolent dictatorship by someone who was super wise and didn't abuse power. But like no such dictators exist. I don't trust any dictators. To be benevolent, not abuse the power, so democracy is what we're stuck with. Does that make sense? I can imagine a benevolent dictator who maybe tries to do what you're saying, but I just don't trust any actual humans to pull it off. Other questions? Sir?
I think there's maybe another point that's not like forced conversions, but maybe like we have a situation in the US, right, where we have a lot of like laws that are kind of imply a Christian sense of morality. Take like pornography laws, for example, right? So prostitution is illegal. Right? If you pay someone for sex, that's illegal. But if you film it, suddenly it's legal, right? It's just like kind of incoherent, right? And it seems like you could argue, right, that if we could use the actual like Christian basis for those laws in the first place, you could create a more like coherent view of what ought to be legal and what not, right? Because if one of the roles of government is to establish that which is good, right, and the people in the country are Christian and are thus using the Bible, for example, to determine what is good, but then explicitly not allowing that in the law seems contradictory. Right, I mean, it's like everyone outside is using it in their head to reach the conclusion as to what laws we should advocate for, but then in practice we can't actually write that. That's why we reach those laws. So, do you think?
I mean, I'm sort of with you. Do you think a non-Christian country? Do you think you could have a non-Christian country that bans prostitution and bans pornography?
I mean, I think
you could.
Sure.
I think those do exist. So banning pornography or banning prostitution are not inherently elevating Christianity. You could argue that banning pornography and banning prostitution both protect the weak from abuse and from exploitation. So I think you
Yeah.
can make a kind of a common good natural law case for both of those without saying, and therefore I'm enshrining Christianity as top dog.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Sir. Oh, sorry, there's a mic floating around.
You put a lot of emphasis on the government, but as we've seen really throughout the past 30 or so years, let's say, or even throughout history, that fundamentally power structures like governments are leaky. They are susceptible to like bleeding power towards either autocrats or oligarchs and whatnot, but you're not government, such as, well, to do a common modern one would be a corporation. You know, they aren't the government, but they are still fundamentally liberal institutions that sort of do what they want. They're autocratic. How do you square that circle?
Oh, that's a bigger question than I think I can ask in one evening. I will say, I guess I would echo your question. I think maybe that's something for us to discuss from here on out. I will say, it's interesting to note that some people, when you say, what are you paranoid about? What are you worried about? Your average libertarian is like, I'm worried about government power. But more and more people are worried about giant multinational corporations deciding what you can and can't read. You know, like stuff like that has happened. Like if Amazon says, hey man, we're not selling your book. Like, your book's not going to sell very well. And so I think that's a legitimate worry, is like if corporations are extremely powerful, then like, what do you do in that situation? I don't have good answers to that. Because corporations aren't subject to the Constitution in the same way. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry, there's a...
Oh.
We'll,
Go ahead.
We'll get you and then we'll get you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm really, when you had the slide where it was like the green
Yeah.
and then the red,
Uh-huh.
I think there's a major in between where, yes, we're not doing the red because that's like extremely obvious. We're doing a lot of things in between where we are requiring taxpayer money is going towards putting Bibles in schools. We don't have taxpayer money going towards putting, the Quran in schools. And I think there would be a big jump before that, there'd be a huge hurdle before that would happen. That's just an example, but I mean, we have 10 commandments all over the place that taxpayer money is going towards. So, I mean, there's a yellow category.
Yeah, I think I would broadly agree. If taxpayer money, if they said, you can use taxpayer money to put dollars in schools and not Qurans, like, that's almost red to me. Some of the more, I think part of what you're getting at is some things that are symbolic, like the 10 Commandments being put up. This is what I think of, by the way. A lot of Christian nationalists are not interested in actual policy. They're interested in symbols. And there's a big part of me that's like, woo, a symbol, yeah. Like, I have a harder time getting amped up about that. But you're right that in those cases, there's kind of the history of our country says it's good to put up the 10 Commandments, but am I privileging a certain religion? I don't know. You're right. Those are kind of wishy-washy in the middle. I agree. Yeah, good points.
So from like a practical sense of this whole presentation, like if you were a Christian lawmaker like in Congress, from the context of everything you just presented, do you believe that like a policy you wanted to enact, whether it be like on the green side or maybe something even more in between, it would have to be morally defensible from a secular perspective in order for it to not like, veer into the religious nationalism territory?
That's a great question. So to your point, I think virtually all of these green laws I've got here, you could make the case to people from a variety of religious backgrounds, or no religious more secular atheists. You can make a case to a pretty wide swath of people who don't necessarily believe in your religion that these are good ideas. Maybe an extreme example would be blasphemy laws. If you say like if you say blasphemous thing XYZ, you go to jail. I think you'd have a much harder case. You have a much harder case in convincing wide swaths of people that that's a good idea. It's going to impinge on freedom of speech, things like that. So anyway, to answer your question, if I were a lawmaker, would I try to stay in this green zone and not advocate for things that depends solely upon like my reading of Scripture, yeah, I probably would. Yeah.
So
In the back. Yep, go ahead.
So kind of on that note, like piggybacking off that question, so you said that like if these people can agree that it's good, then you would say that it's fine, right? But if they didn't agree, like let's say that somebody's like, oh, I just really love pornography and you can't convince me otherwise, like do you think that we shouldn't enforce that? And maybe taking a more extreme example, because that's kind of odd, that more real life example, it's like, do you think it's right to force people to stop human sacrifice? Because that actually is a real life example.
Stop what?
Human sacrifice.
Oh, I see.
Because that actually is like a real life example that's part and parcel of many religions, right? But we know it's evil, right? Even though those people are unconvinced and probably would require force to convince, like it probably is better that they are convinced by force rather than by persuasion, right? Because like, you know, maybe they won't be convinced by persuasion, right? If that makes sense, what I'm saying.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great this is a good question. There's a lot of great First Amendment law on things like that. Like, so human sacrifice is a little bit easier because it's like, oh, the government, this religion says we got to have human sacrifice, and the government's squishing how they're. So the way that the Supreme Court would argue that is they'd say the government has a compelling interest in protecting the lives of its citizen, and so that allows them to overcome that First Amendment concern. A more borderline case would be, what if a specific religion says you must take drugs? So this actually happened. A guy, I think it was peyote or something, a guy took peyote for religious reasons. The criminal justice system came down on him, and the Supreme Court actually sided with the person because they said, oh, this is a deeply held religious conviction, and the government doesn't have a compelling reason to squish this person's First Amendment rights over this drug use. So those are the kind of balancing laws that the government uses to figure out, if we have a law restricting something, is it squishing someone's First Amendment or other rights? And that would actually apply to pornography too. Maybe Congress passes a no pornography law, and then people would bring a claim of like, that intrudes on my First Amendment rights, blah, 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 and the government would do some kind of a balancing test. So that's generally, that's more of a legal question maybe than a moral question, but yeah.
And I guess the reason why I ask is like, would we side with the courts? Like, because basically the courts like what should be added, but not what the law per se. Right?
Yeah.
So in either case, with clarity or pornography, it seems that we should advocate for like imitation or pornography.
Right.
Irrespective of that. So it seems that in principle, because like we're not saying it's good because it's liberal. Because I think one of your points is that Christian nationalism is done because it's a liberal. We disagree, right? Like basically, like we should allow liberalism in as much as like Christianity allows it, which I think is very non-controversial. Right? We should not allow Christianity because liberalism. But like basically, God's the final standard, not like some 18th century Bible.
Yeah. Again, we're getting close to our time. I guess what you should feel tension. When someone says, let's ban pornography, you should feel the tension between like, ooh, it'd be awfully good if we didn't have that. But then on the other hand, like, ooh, the government being able to squish certain kinds of speech and what can be like, I don't know if I like that. That tension is what you should feel. That tension is what you should feel. And the Constitution is just a way to put like certain guardrails of keeping the government from going completely into the I can do whatever I darn well please for the sake of the common good, saying the government, you have guardrails that you can't go beyond this level. I guess that's what I would say. There's a wonderful legal podcast called Advisory Opinions that's primarily about constitutional law. It has literally made me like rethink my life decisions and be like, man, I should have gone to law school. This is amazing. And I would definitely recommend it to all of you. Last question. Yes. Oh, sorry. Oh, all right. That was last questions. Okay, sorry. I'll catch you later. Oh, we got to go.